Burnout is the end result of long-term chronic stress. Chronic stress that is just going and going and going and going, and eventually it will break down the systems in your body. It will break down your cardiovascular system, it will break down your immune system, it will break down your nervous system, it will break down the structure of your brain.
Cait Donovan is a leading burnout expert, keynote speaker, and host of Fried, the Burnout podcast.
Combining Eastern wellness with Western science, she empowers individuals and organizations to overcome burnout.
People are like, why does burnout recovery take so long? Well, because you've got to disappoint people in those miniature ways for like a year before you're willing to be like, no, I'm not going to make the cupcakes this time. Burnout prevention, just to be really clear for everybody listening, is just stress management. That's it.
Welcome back to Flip Your Mindset. I'm so excited for today's episode. Today, I'm joined by Cait Donovan. She's a keynote speaker and an expert in burnout who uniquely blends Western behavioral sciences with Eastern wellness philosophies. If you've known me, you know burnout is a huge topic for me. It's something that I speak on often as well. And Cait is by far the best person I've ever been able to jam out on burnout with. Cait has dedicated her entire career to helping individuals and organizations understand and overcome burnout. In today's episode, we're going to dive into how burnout affects the brain and explore strategies for prevention recovery. You do not want to miss it. I'm so excited to have you here today. I remember the very first time I spoke to you. I was actually inquiring about the National Speakers Association, and I reached out to you on LinkedIn because I saw that you were affiliated on the board, and I also saw that your expertise was burnout, and we jammed out so hard. Mm-hmm. And I remember you saying, you're like, there's very few people I can like nerd out with on burnout. So I'm really happy to have you here today because it's a hot topic for my audience. And I think so many people struggle with it, that the more content we can put out there to help people understand what it is and why they're struggling, the better.
Amen.
So I'm just going to ask you, Cait, your definition of burnout.
I always start with the World Health Organization definition, even though I don't agree with it fully, because I think if we're going to have a conversation about a thing, then we should all be talking about the same thing to start with. And I think that that's really important. So the World Health Organization says that burnout is a workplace phenomenon, first thing that I disagree with, that has 3 factors. And those 3 factors are, the first is physical and emotional exhaustion. You'll find this in different words in different places, but the first is physical and emotional exhaustion. The second is detachment and cynicism. And the third is feeling a lack of impact or lack of productivity in your work. And so there's the World Health Organization, May 18th, 2019, decided burnout was a thing. It is not a diagnosis. It is an occupational hazard.
Right. Now, what about if, for those people who are listening, who are not in a vocation, right? So maybe they're not working. Maybe it's not an, I'm putting in quotes, occupational hazard. Yeah. And yet they're feeling so crispy and fried. Yeah. But they're not in the workforce. Can they have burnout?
1,000%. And that's why it irks me, right? So for me, burnout is the end result of long-term chronic stress. And I use long-term and chronic side by side on purpose. Chronic stress that is just going and going and going and going. And eventually it will break down the systems in your body. It will break down your cardiovascular system. It will break down your immune system. It will break down your nervous system. It will break down the structure of your brain. It will break down your gut microbiome. It will atrophy your muscles. It will all of the things. So when stress has lasted at a particular level long enough in your life, in order for it to create physiological and emotional and all the things, issues, then it's burnout.
Okay. So the first half of that definition, that chronic prolonged stress, right? This is part of, the definition that is complex PTSD. Yeah. And, I tend to tie in personally from my seat, complex PTSD and developmental trauma. Yep. So that chronic prolonged, stress during your developmental years, though maybe you could have a great childhood and have some resilience built up, but go through a series of, prolonged chronic stress later on in life, right? But I do question, this is where I like to get nerdy, like from your seat, do you feel that people who had that chronic prolonged stress in their developmental years are more prone to burning out in their adult life than people who did not have that growing up?
Yeah, of course.
But then had like shit show in their 20s and 30s.
Yeah, I think we're more likely when we have it during the ACEs during childhood. I wrote a 14-page paper on this.
Yeah. Well, ACEs is like my jam.
Yeah.
So how would you summarize your finding on that? And for those people who are new to my podcast, because I don't ever like to assume, I know what it is, but for the benefit of the listener, can you just describe ACEs and why you did that paper?
Yeah. So ACEs means adverse childhood experiences, and you get an ACEs score. So there's this very short questionnaire that really needs some serious updating that gives you a score from 0 to 10, and anything above 4, adverse childhood experiences, says that most likely there was some interference with how your brain developed and with how you interact with the world. So there's worse health outcomes. There's more tendency toward alcohol abuse and drug abuse and all of these other things. So if you can, and the thing that got me about this personally was that my ACE score is a 3.
Okay. I'm a 4 or 5, depending on what, the skills changed a little bit. I'm in the 4 or 5 zone.
I'm like a borderline kind of gal.
3, 4. Yeah. Okay.
And I think there's a couple problems with that whole system. Is one, that it doesn't measure protective factors.
Correct.
Right? Because there's people that could have an ACEs of 7 out of 10, which would mean that they're basically like developmentally unable to adult completely, but they had this like total kick-ass grandmother.
That's right. And that's for the audience. Again, the protective factors are, what are the things that could balance it out?
Yeah.
Right? Because resilience is kind of the antithesis of the ACEs. So who could you go to in your school? What did you have a mentor? Did you have a family member? Did you have a community center outlet? Did you have a place where you could go?
The Boys and Girls Club, the YMCA, the whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And did you have it and did you use it? Because having it doesn't mean anything.
Amen. Right.
So when I was writing my book, I realized that I had to admit some of that childhood trauma from my own life in order to understand why I burnt out later. And at the time, before I met you and before I met some other people that now are talking about it, this was 2016, no one was discussing this that I could find. Of course, there were people discussing it because ACEs research is older than 2016. It was not, I wasn't aware of it enough to be picking up on the research and the people that were talking about it. I had already read Gabor Mate and When the Body Keeps a Score. I'm an acupuncturist. I've been in non-traditional healthcare for 20 years. It's not, none of these things were surprising to me or completely out of my realm, but there was certain vocabulary and ways that people were talking about it that were missing from what I had access to at that moment. I said the words like nobody was talking about it. And I hate when people say that because there's always somebody talking about it somewhere.
But it wasn't the noise in the grand scheme of the world where you were picking up on it.
Yes, but it existed. I just wasn't tapped into it. Yeah. And I had to really come to terms with the fact that although I love my parents and had overarching, like a pretty supportive and wonderful childhood with a lot of what I now call BPFs, like SPFs, but for burnout protection factors. I had a lot of BPFs in my life, but I also had some serious BRFs. I had some serious risk factors. I had some serious ACEs that affected the way that I viewed the world and the beliefs that I created and the values that I held dear and all of that stuff long term. So I think that was something I had to manage. And then what I noticed, because, I've worked one-on-one with people since, 2005, I guess I started seeing patients. So it's been a long time.
As an acupuncturist.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've done more than 30,000 acupuncture treatments in my career. I have talked to a lot of people about a lot of things. in a lot of
Yeah.
countries all over the world. And what I noticed was there's a particular feature of people that end up in acupuncture offices, which I think is oftentimes related to burnout because they've already seen their doctor and their therapist and their surgeon and
there's nothing wrong.
and there's nothing wrong, and then but they don't feel good, and then they find acupuncture, so we're often the end of the road. So I was treating people with burnout for years without knowing that was happening. And what I realized in this community of people was that most of them were missing the signs along the way.
So what are the signs that we're missing for people that they didn't know was burnout?
It doesn't even matter because for every single person, it's going to be different. For one person, it's going to be neck pain that led to migraines. For another person, it's going to be disenchantment at work that led to crying in a corner because you can't get through your day, but not understanding that you could change your job. It could be stomach issues. It could be vision loss. It could be, anything. It could be literally any symptom that your body can create. It could be. Right. And it doesn't even matter if it ends up in burnout. The fact of the functionality that I'm thinking about is this idea that there's so many of us that have no relationship and no communication with our bodies at all. So you're losing your vision and you're just trying to work around it.
Yeah. It's so interesting that you say that because at my worst burnout, and this is my second of two, what I call nervous breakdowns, because even though it's considered burnout in the grand scheme of the world, I know for sure my nervous system broke down. And the first time I ever talked about the idea of a nervous breakdown versus burnout, I was a guest on somebody else's podcast. And I said, honestly, you can call it burnout, but I call it a nervous breakdown. And she goes, well, I think of a nervous breakdown as like someone in hysteria, but they can't get out of their room and they're in a dark room. And I'm like, well, if I could have stayed in bed in a dark room, I would have.
Yeah.
I had children. And I didn't have that luxury, or I didn't think I had that luxury. And when I brought that up to her, she was like, oh shit. But to your point, and actually I've never put two and two together until right now. The second time I had this breakdown of my nervous system, I started losing a little bit of vision in one of my eyes. It was almost like a weird tunnel vision. And it was starting to freak me the fuck out. And the first thing I did was go to a massage therapist and my acupuncturist. So this was in 2012, 2013. And it was not the first time I had done acupuncture. I had done it many times prior, but my body, the muscles in my neck were so tight. It was literally squeezing my optical nerve.
Well, that's number one. Number two is when you have chronic stress, let's talk about functional stress, right? Stress is a good thing.
Okay.
You need adrenaline to focus, all of that. So say you have a test that you need to study for, and you need to study, and you're on a little bit of a time crunch. Your body floods you with adrenaline, and you're able to focus all of your energy in one direction. It's literally how focus is based on adrenaline, right? So for people that I know that I'm not teaching you anything right now, but for people out there, focus requires adrenaline, and it's not a bad thing. Totally normal, totally fine. Your adrenaline goes up, it goes down, you lose focus, you try again. Okay? When you are under chronic stress and you have that level of adrenaline that keeps driving up and keeps driving up, people always love to talk about cortisol, but it's a related but separate function. When your adrenaline keeps going up, you keep focusing in, and eventually you put on horse blinders, basically. And this actually happens. You lose peripheral vision due to chronic stress. So your brain is putting on horse blinders, and then you lose the ability to think outside the box. So you don't see, that's what people are like, but I didn't see any options. Of course you didn't see any options. You couldn't see anything at all except for the problem that was right in front of you that you couldn't solve.
Right.
This is why I think it's so critical to work with people when you're going through something like this, because I don't care how many DIY courses you watch, your perspective doesn't widen until somebody offers you a different option, you know?
All right. So I have a couple of different things that I want to talk to you about. So I'm going to try to go succinctly for the purpose of the conversation. So number one, okay, when people think of burnout generally, right? Like not someone who studies it or focuses on it for a career, but when the general person's experiencing burnout, they tend to think I'm just overly stressed. And I also hear them saying, I should be able to do, and I can't. And so what I really want to talk about is the difference between this, or how prolonged stress creates the burnout, but more specifically, what's happening to the brain. Like, I really want to get into the nitty gritty. What happens inside the brain function? While you're talking, I'm going to grab my little brain model. As you're talking about it, I can actually like point people to shit.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the brain and what's actually happening, because a lot of what we've been talking about up to this point is this, prefrontal cortex piece.
Yeah.
So let's talk about it, because sometimes people, they beat themselves up for things that they can't do when they get to this state. Like when I first experienced burnout, which came after a 20-year state of heightened anxiety, right? So when I look at something like a polyvagal theory or like a window of tolerance kind of situation, how my body sustained being in this level of heightened state from the age of 13 to 33 is beyond me. But I did. And then basically the flip just switched and my body was like, well, you can't sustain that anymore. So flop and drop. And for me, the tipping point and the burnout, the breakdown was I went from being super high functioning anxiety, way type A, push through, to waking up and like molasses, like everything was such effort. If I wanted to make a cup of coffee, I would just stand in front of the coffee maker. Like, I don't know what I want. Do I want milk? I don't know. What kind of mug? I don't know. Like, I literally could not make a decision. I couldn't go to work. I could normally do an Excel spreadsheet with 100, sheets in the workbook. And I could get my computer on. I would look at it. I'd have no idea what I was doing. And it was scary because I went from being able to do 7,000 things at one time, and that adrenaline that you talked about was pushing me through, to having no adrenaline whatsoever, dropping and flopping into that dorsal vagal state. And I remember so vividly saying to my husband, when we watch commercials for depression, this is what they're talking about, but I don't feel sad.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not sad. I just don't exist right now. So explain to people what's happening inside the body where you actually don't feel like you're existing and nothing matters anymore.
So there's something that the brain does called pruning. And this happens at a couple of different times during development, right? Like you grow all these neural connections and then you go through a certain age period and you cut away the things that you don't need. Your brain literally prunes away neural connections that it doesn't need, like a gardener would. And then you go through it while you're a kid, you go through it again as a teenager. When you are under chronic stress, your brain starts to prune any connections that it doesn't need for your daily survival. So you start losing neural connections, and your brain actually by volume shrinks. Because you're losing neurons. It's just cutting things off. It's saying, we don't need this. We don't need this. This isn't helping right now. This isn't useful right now. This leaf, get rid of it.
Explain why it's doing that.
Well, because it's trying to conserve energy.
Right.
That's the brain's biggest function, is to conserve energy, to keep things efficient.
To keep you alive.
Yeah. On the most basic level. So when you are, that chronic stress gets to that point where you start really breaking down, your brain in most areas has shrunk. In some, depending on the research you read, has grown or shrunk. It depends.
Right. So they might say the amygdala grows.
They might say the amygdala grows, but in some research, they say that it shrinks. It depends on what you're reading at any particular moment. I call the amygdala amygdala.
Yeah, exactly.
So Amy gets a little hyperactive, a little hyper-focused. She sees danger where there is none. She's absolutely losing her mind. She's setting off your stress system even more and more frequently because she's seeing danger where there isn't any. Like, for example, I was walking through the forest one day by my house, which is not far from your house, really. So I'm walking through the forest, and I jumped back real quick because I thought I saw a snake.
I'd jump if I saw a snake.
Right? I jumped back. And then my prefrontal cortex, which loses lots of neurons, is where your rational thought is. It's where you regulate your emotions. It's where you adult. It's all your executive functioning. My rational mind looked down and went, oh, that's the root of a tree in the shape of a snake.
Right.
And so then my body went, okay, you're safe, you're fine. And
adjust.
And your hormones go back to normal-ish, not immediately. It takes some time, but still you're fine. When you are burnt out, you see the snake, you jump, and then you still think it's a snake.
I love that analogy. So I want to talk about amygdala. Okay. So amygdala is the amygdala, and it's this teeny tiny
almond-shaped gland. There's two of them, right? One on each side.
Right. In your brain, deep in the center, deep in. And I always call it like the light switch. It's like the DEFCON 10, switch of threat. And the moment, and to your point, it's like, oh my God, I think I see a snake. Chink, it's on. And then it's almost like a light switch in the sense of, even though you don't see it in your house because it's within the wall, the moment you turn on a light switch, a lot of circuits. And so that's what happens in the brain when you turn the amygdala on, or when your amygdala engages for you, right? Because it's trying to keep you safe. But when you do that, this part of your brain goes offline, right? That prefrontal cortex, short wires, I would say, right?
For less than a 100th of a second.
But if this, and this is what I think was the case with me, is engaged and stuck in that on position, if the light switch has been pushed on, now just imagine, let's just say that you had a childhood where it wasn't safe to turn off the switch.
Yeah.
Meaning, when you go back to that ACEs, say your school is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've had clients whose scores are 8, 9, 10. Even I, at a 4, 5, feel like my switch was on more times than it even needed to be, almost as like a preventative measure.
Yeah.
When it's on, and then this is going off and off and off and off, you're kind of training your brain to go off.
Well, and then you prune.
Right. So this is why a lot of people end up having issues with executive function, managing their emotions, A to B to the C to D, all the way to the Z, like the logical, orderly thinking, the planning, the prioritizing, the managing of the time. These are not behavioral choices.
No.
These are neurological functions that are impacted sometimes when that amygdala is engaged. So my mother used to say, how come you're having such a hard time in school? Now, I didn't have this language. It was 1985, 86, 87 when I was in high school. And I would say, all I could say is because I'm under too much stress. I knew that enough.
Which is more than most people would say.
Yeah, I don't know how I knew it. Honestly, I also don't know how I found a therapist at age 16 in 1987. I have no idea how I did it.
Yeah.
It was like I blinked my eyes and yet there I was.
Yeah.
And I was the one pushing it forward. But, the reality is that I knew enough to know that I'm very, very smart. And I knew enough to know that there was something off, that I could not engage. I was so exhausted from fighting the stress all the time. I was not engaged the way I knew I could be.
Well, in addition, the other part of your brain that shrinks is the hippocampus.
So explain to people what the function of the hippocampus is.
You are never going to forget this ever in your entire life. What is the animal that never forgets?
The elephant.
Yeah. In your brain, it's a hippo.
Oh, you're so smart. You're right. And so I'm just going to point to people where this is. Okay. So in your brain, again, deep within the center, right next to the amygdala, this is your,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. This is your hippocampus right here. And let's talk about, okay. So you said the part that never forgets.
So your hippocampus is not the only place that memory is stored. There's a lot of the memory function of the brain has a lot of different networks and a lot of subsets, but a large portion of where we consolidate memories is in the hippocampus. So when we're losing hippocampal tissue during burnout and chronic stress, we don't have as much access to our memories, which means the things that we are relaying to people are often wrong. And B, we don't have access to our information that we've memorized and sort of kept top of minds. Like I had a client once who was like, people used to walk by my door and be like, well, what's the cost of so-and-so for whatever. And she'd be like $43,078.62. She said, people started asking me the question. I didn't have access to it. And she knew she was getting better. She wrote to me one day. She was like, oh my God, you're never going to believe what happened today. I was like, what happened today? She said, you know, those stupid 6-digit codes that you have to put into your computer to get into your bank account because they need you to have like 87 authorizations. She said, I looked at the 6-digit code and I put it in my keypad without looking at it again.
It's huge.
Right. And that's not necessarily a hippocampal function. That's a different type of memory. But still, the point is that part of your brain shrinks too. And the anterior cingulate cortex, which is sort of like a relay, like a nexus center for a lot of things. That's how your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala talk to one another, right? That shrinks too. So your amygdala is on fire. Your prefrontal cortex can't explain away why it's on fire. And the thing that's supposed to help those things talk to each other, totally not functioning. Then,
go ahead.
The insula. It's not important what it's called. And this is another part of almost everything that happens in the brain happens in many, many networks and is not isolated to one small area. That's not exactly how brain science works. But this part of the brain, the insula, is a crossroads and nexus for a skill that's known as interoception.
Yeah. So explain what that is.
Interoception is internal sensing. Interoception, sensing internally. So this is, your body does a lot of this subconsciously. Like when you're too hot, it will make you sweat so that you start to cool down, or, things like that. Like it's this natural way of maintaining a dynamic state where you're fairly balanced.
Your homeostasis.
Yeah, I don't like that word.
I know. That's why I brought it up.
I don't like that word. Homeostasis means status. Stasis is static. And the homeostatic state is, there's nothing static about homeostasis. Right. It's super dynamic. But this, there's part of interoceptive function that is subconscious. And there's part of interoceptive function that is conscious. So, for instance, interoception is your ability to notice that the cells of your bladder have stretched, and your osmoreceptors are sending information to your brain that says, I have to go to the bathroom. Right? This part of your brain doesn't function real well with chronic stress. And also, what's interesting about it is underdeveloped in people that have high levels of ACEs. This is why I always say burnout is not your fault, and I don't believe in burnout prevention unless you've burnt out already and you're preventing a relapse. Because those of us that burn out, we do not typically, there's exceptions to every rule, we do not typically have enough interoceptive function to feel when things are going wrong, so we don't notice until we're half blind in one eye. Right? We don't notice the signals because we are not tuned into them because that part of our brain is not developed.
So I want to point this out because to your point, you're like, I get the end of it when they come to the acupuncturist because everything. So what I was writing down here is how many people I know have sat across from me, either in a session here on my couch where they're like, well, I've been to the neurologist. Mm-hmm. I can't remember anything anymore. Mm-hmm. My brain's not working for me. And there must be something wrong medically with me physiologically with me, with my brain, because I used to be able to do all of this and now I can't do any of it. And so therefore I must have a brain tumor or I must have something going on. And, there's just been such missing link in the medical community between the mind and the body and what's going on in our environment, how our body responds in a normal way to an abnormal set of circumstances or an abnormal environment. I mean, what's your feeling about like what's missing, especially as somebody that was, practicing acupuncture and you were, I don't think acupuncture is alternative medicine, but I'm going to put it into quotes.
It is considered.
I've been using it for so long and, in every medical, they're like, I'll give you steroids. I'm like, I'll go see my acupuncturist. And we try to work it out in that space. But, for someone that's listening that might feel like you are describing them and they've been going to the doctor because there must be something wrong because this thing isn't functioning the right way. How do you help them bridge that understanding and that knowledge that the mind and the body are actually functioning the way that they're designed to function given the environment or given the level of stress,
given the circumstances that they were given during childhood and given the environment that they're in and given the lack of interoceptive skills and given to me, this is why it's so important to take out the brain and point at the things and say, listen, this is what's happening. And it's not your fault that that's what's happening. And it's not your fault that you didn't notice that it was happening because you probably didn't develop in a way that allowed you to notice it, especially if your particular ACEs, like mine, have to do with the fact that you had to tune in to an adult's emotional and mental state in order to know when you needed to keep yourself safe. You weren't thinking about how you felt and what you needed. You were trying to make sure the adult in your life got what they needed so you could avoid yelling or drinking or whatever other thing. So to me, it's not your fault that you didn't pay attention to and then on top of all of those ACEs things, you go to school and they tell you to raise your hand when you have to go to the bathroom and then don't allow you to go sometimes. Then maybe you were in sports. I was a gymnast. You didn't pay attention to your pain. You taped it up and you kept bouncing. There's so many ways that we are taught to disconnect from the sensations in our body that it's not your fault that you got to adulthood and didn't understand what they were trying to tell
or deprioritized your own needs. But it's so interesting. And I want to just go a little bit off the path here because I just think it's so important because I hear it so often. And I absolutely identified as such forever. And I do. Look, you and I have talked about this. We both have very, very strong sixth senses. We have very, very strong intuitions, right? And
from trauma.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Let's just take that and put that over here for a second. Like, how does that develop? However, how many people come into a session and like, well, I'm a real empath.
Yeah.
I'm an empath. And when I first came across the word empath, I'm going to say it was like 2011. Mm-hmm. And I remember looking at my husband like, oh my God, there's a word here that literally describes me. Like I've always known this about me, but I didn't know that there was an actual word for it or that anybody else was like this. And for the longest time, I was like, I'm just an empath. And I also was told I come from a long line of people who have very, very strong sixth senses. Okay. So again, over here. However, to Cait's point, when you grow up in an environment, your mind and your body really have one primary job, and that's to keep you alive, right? And anything that feels like a threat, even something that's perceived as a threat, is a threat to that ability to be alive. So even if you go to the most basic of like Maslow's hierarchy shit, where you've got like your physiological needs, you've got safety and security, you've got love and belonging. And when we look at these things, we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for just enough, right? As long as it's met well enough. then your body can be regulated. And for people that are not watching, I'm putting in a lot of quotes here. If you sense to your experience and what you just shared, like if I don't make this person more comfortable, more happy, if I'm not meeting their needs, then that love and belonging could be at risk, or that safety and security could be at risk, or getting food made for me tonight for dinner could be at risk. Or I might not have clean clothes, or mom or dad might be drinking too much where they can't pay the rent and we're going to get evicted again. So we start to parentify, even though it's not conscious.
Of course not.
We do whatever we can to meet the other person's needs. So we've gotten really tuned. This is that neuroception, right? So you're feeling out, you're outside of you, you're looking around and you're going, where do I need to be? What need needs to be met? Where do I need to be? And you start to figure out how other people feel in order to create that sense. And sense is the key word, safety and security. We can call that empathic, but really you've trained your mind and your body to sense other people's needs. And when you're constantly doing that, you're not paying attention to your own.
You can't. You are officially self-abandoning and self-neglecting.
100%.
So for me, if you consider yourself an empath, but you don't know what's going on in you, you are not an empath. A true empath is grounded in their own experience first. Anything other than that is trauma.
I love you for saying it, because I so gently and eloquently get my client to understand that in their own time and their own safe space, with a lot of questioning of, is it or is it this? Let's take a look at this. When did you stop meeting your own needs? And usually I'll hear stuff like, well, I don't remember a time where I was putting my needs first. Right? And so a lot of people think that we've been taught putting our needs first is selfish. It's not selfish. It's important. I don't even know the word. It's survival. Like, you have to meet your own needs. It's okay to meet your own needs. All of this, think about this, guys. This is the full circle. All of this brings you back to burnout. Because when you have trained your mind and your body to feel out, recognize, be aware of, sense on those little tiny hairs all over your body what other people need, and you're people pleasing and you're not setting boundaries and you're seeking out that validation. Did I do it right? Did I meet it enough? Did I meet it enough? What else do you need? It is the recipe for you breaking down. Yeah. So when we talk about, we don't have to use the World Health Organization's definition. When we talk about burnout, it's physical, mental, psychological exhaustion. Well, wouldn't it be fucking exhausted to be doing that 24/7?
Exactly. Well, and I think this lends to, if you'll allow the next sort of veering, this lends to a really serious conversation about people pleasing. Because when you grow up like that and you learn to people please in that way, and then you read an Instagram account, right? You read an Instagram account that says no is a complete sentence, and you find yourself unable to do it. And you're like, I know I'm a people pleaser, but I can't stop. Well, no kidding, you can't stop. You have 40 years of information in your body that says people pleasing is what keeps you safe. So engaging in a practice that goes against people pleasing makes you feel unsafe and kicks off your nervous system.
So it's so interesting that you should say that. So there's a couple of things that came to my mind. Number one, as you know, I do parts work, right? So I love helping my clients identify that part of themselves, separate from their self energy, so they can see that there was a part of themselves that had to activate in their benefit, in survival. And that part, by the way, is exhausted. And how do we, from a very compassionate point of view, start to develop a healthier relationship with that part of it so it doesn't feel so burdened to keep it up for us? Number one. And that's a process, guys. But number two, so interestingly, so did you read the let them theory?
I didn't.
Okay. So I read it because I was very curious. So I read a lot of things because I'm very curious. And I've actually never read any of Mel Robbins' stuff before. And I've listened to her certainly on podcasts and seen YouTube clips and all this different stuff. And for whatever reason, I've seen her speak like 5 times in person for a variety of reasons. But I was curious. So I read the book. Now, as someone who's been doing work since I was 13, I'm 53. Okay, so for 40 years, it made a lot of sense to me. It's very practical. It was very relevant. It's very easy to put into place.
Yeah.
However, that being said, I was looking for the things I was looking for my clients. And when I was done reading the book, I happened to be like, I guess I must be on her newsletter list or whatever. So I get this email in my inbox, and I thought, fuck it, I'm just going to do it. So I respond and I go, hey, this is a message from Mel. I don't know that she'll ever get it, but I feel really compelled to share this. And I said, listen, I just read the book. For me, it all makes sense. It works. I can put this into practice. However, for my clients that are not recovered from and are in the process of healing from complex PTSD, things like people pleasing, inability to set boundaries, seeking that constant validation, that is a deeply rooted skill set of survival in their nervous system that they can't just let go of. They just can't. It's not going to feel safe to their body and to their nervous system to just let go. I said, what's great about the book is this is something we can work towards. This is something we can aspire to. But my concern is that people who read this, because it's getting so much great press, and I do think it's a good book, if they can't do it, it's going to make them feel a lot of shame, and it's going to make them feel even worse, because in survival, this would not feel like a safe thing to be able to do. And it's interesting because a local store has asked me to moderate the book. We have 3 sold out dates where I'm going in and moderating this book. And I told them, I like the book. I will be happy to moderate it. I think it's an important conversation to have, but I will be bringing this in because there's no way out of 75 people over 3 instances of this book club moderation that there's not going to be a large percentage that I just described. I don't want them to feel like they're broken. They're not broken.
Do
you know what I'm saying?
I started my podcast. Because most of the information that I was finding at the time about burnout was a lot of information for burnout prevention, which I've already said I think is nonsense because you are not looking at burnout prevention until you're already burnt out, and which point those are not the skills.
We're looking at burnout recovery here.
Yeah, like you don't preventive burnout prevention. Just to be really clear for everybody listening, is just stress management. That's it.
But when your lived survival mechanisms no longer can function in that stress, it's almost like impossible to mitigate.
Exactly. So yeah. So everybody that was talking about it was talking about burnout prevention, and they were all saying the same sort of like, I've been practicing Eastern medicine for a long time. So they were like, well, take deep breaths and I'm like, for some people, deep breaths are going to be the biggest panic-inducing thing on the planet. So I don't necessarily, if that's not working for you, what you need to understand is that that's okay. You might come back to it at another time and be able to do it differently. But if there's practices that are not working for you, I tell people all the time in the podcast, if I say something that's not right for you, you have the ultimate decision in your body. It's not for me to say, especially on a podcast that thousands of people are going to listen to, tens of thousands of people are going to listen to. It is not my job to tell you what's correct for you in this moment in time in your body. I do not have that information.
Right.
I just don't. This is another reason why I think it's so important for people that go through things like this to work with someone in small groups. Our biggest groups are like 8 people max, and that's already pushing it. We aim for 5, but it's like you really need space to explore what would work for you and try some things out and see what happens. And when it comes to people pleasing, I always ask people to start bothering and disappointing people slowly, day by day. Like in really small ways, like somebody's already in the kitchen, ask them to bring you a glass of water. It's so uncomfortable.
Dude,
but it's not
so uncomfortable.
necessarily unsafe. And you know logically like that it's not necessarily unsafe. So this is, I had Heather Hansen. I don't know if you've met her yet. She's incredible on my podcast ages ago. And she talks about keeping an evidence journal and just starting to keep track
Oh, I love that.
right? Keep the data points. I asked so-and-so for a glass of water today and I'm still loved. Like I haven't been abandoned yet. Like,
and I'm safe.
Yeah, like,
and
safe.
it makes me think about someone walking into a kitchen. Think about it. Someone walking into a kitchen and just walking past someone and just automatically saying, "Oh, I'm sorry."
Yeah. Exactly things like this. So I ask people to slightly disappoint and slightly bother at least one person a day while they're in burnout recovery in the smallest of ways. When they say, "What do you want for dinner?" actually choosing something instead of saying whatever is fine.
You're going to love this. So, and this client actually she's done video testimonials for me. She's been on my podcast. She's talked about this on her story. Yeah. So this is not a new story. I can share this. She came in for my consult, just for the consult. And I said, use 3 words to describe yourself. And I don't even know what the other 2 words were, but the first thing she said is, "I'm super easygoing."
Oh,
and I was like, okay, right? I'm super easygoing. And I was like, okay, like, so she describes the other things. And I go, describe easygoing to me. And she's like, oh, like if my husband, she was going through a divorce. If my ex-husband wanted dinner, I'd be like, well, whatever you want. Whatever you want. Like, I'm just so easygoing. I don't care. I'm like, is it that you don't care or do you not have a voice? Like, do you not even know what you like?
Yeah.
And she's like, I actually don't know what I like. I don't even know who I am.
Yeah. I see that a lot.
And so, we kind of encapsulate it in like, I'm so easygoing, but a lot of the time we don't even have an opinion. Because either we had an opinion and we were told was wrong, or we were shamed and blamed and whatever else, ridiculed for even speaking up. And so it just got easier and felt more safe inside our nervous system to just placate and say, what do you want? That's a survival mechanism, guys.
This is one of the reasons that I actually loved Mel Robbins from way back when, because one of her first books is titled "Stop Saying You're Fine."
Yeah, right.
It's like,
right.
And that's the core message. And I think this is a huge part of burnout recovery, that people are like, why does burnout recovery take so long? Well, because you've got to disappoint people in those miniature ways for like a year before you're willing to be like, no, I'm not going to make the cupcakes this time.
Okay, so let's talk about, I love the evidence journal. I'm definitely going to start using that with my clients. It's brilliant. Let's talk about, since we're not going to talk about prevention because it's complete bullshit. When someone is recognizing, okay, I don't have a brain tumor. I don't have an issue with my back that needs a cortisol shot.
Yeah.
I'm really stressed out and I'm holding it in every part of my body. And it is causing me to break down and I'm fried, burnt out, crispy, whatever we want to call it. Now what? So what are some strategies for that recovery that you're talking about?
I think there's 2 things that we always start with in my company. And one of them is foundational self-care. And when I say foundational self-care, I literally am going all the way back to halfway through our conversation when we started talking about interoception. I want you to dig into all of the ways that we can interocept consciously and then start using them intentionally. So that means the unofficial hashtag of my podcast is pee when you have to pee. Because this is literally what it takes. Start taking a deeper breath when you notice that your breathing is shallow, if that's safe for you. Don't write 3 more emails before you go downstairs and get a glass of water. Pee when you have to pee, go to the bathroom when you need to go to the bathroom, rest when you're tired, close your eyes when they're stinging from looking at a computer screen, move when you're antsy. All of if you're cold, get a sweater. If you're hot, take it off. All of the very small ways that we can tune into our body and be conscious of them and start paying attention, you need to use intentionally. Often I have people start with just one of these things, not all of them at once, because it's too many things. So pee when you have to pee is like number one, because we don't do this. So when you do that, you are restating neural function in the insula, which grows your capacity to notice more things in your body and your mind. The interesting thing is when you intentionally up your interoception skills, your emotional regulation improves automatically without you actually having to do anything about it, which is wild, right? Because we often think of emotional regulation as a prefrontal cortex function. However, with the insula, with the interoception, if you know that the emotion is coming up and you can feel it on a physical and emotional level, then you can then shoot that information to the prefrontal cortex so it can do something with it, instead of trying to get into the thinking rational part before you're ready.
Yeah.
Right? So we do this first. So foundational self-care, to get through all the pieces of it and do it well, will take you 6 months to a year.
Yeah.
It just takes.
And I love that you share that, because grace is required.
100%.
You must give yourself some grace, especially if you've been in this for decades. You need to give yourself ample time to rewire your body and rewire your
100%.
mind for new.
Yes. So we do
It's
that
not going
first.
to happen in a week or overnight. You must give yourself time and grace.
Yes. So that's number one. The next thing that we work with is contrary to what almost everyone recommends. I will never ask a burnt out person to do anything with gratitude until they are 75 to 80% of the way recovered. Before that point, it is resentment all the way. Resentment is the absolute key to understanding where your boundaries need to be, what your needs, wants, desires, and preferences are. So for that person who doesn't know what she likes and wants, resentment will teach you. For that person who isn't sure where her energy is and how much she has and when she should say yes and when she should say no, resentment will teach you.
So can you just paint I'm thinking of so many different clients. Can you just paint a picture for the listener of what that looks like?
Yes. So when you recognize and see resentment somewhere, for instance, I was doing dishes and my husband was laying on the couch, and this was recently.
A great example. Go ahead.
Right? I'm doing dishes. He's laying on the couch. I have this need to do the dishes. I don't even know why the housekeepers were coming in the morning. There was literally no reason for me to do the dishes. But I, in my mind, had to get them done before I could relax. I'm 8-10 years out of burnout recovery, and I still make these mistakes, folks. So please, we're not expecting perfection from any of you. So I'm sitting there, and I start to feel resentment build up.
Now, I want to get really clear, because again, not everybody can put a sensation to an emotion. So in my parts work world, I'd be like, where did you feel that in and around your body?
For me, and it will be different for different people because people have different constitutions, but for me in particular, it's a chest constriction matched with an irritation.
Okay.
So I'm looking around, I start to notice this come up, and I thought, oh, that's funny. What's really going on here? And when I thought about it, I wasn't mad that my husband wasn't doing the dishes at all. I was envious that he allowed himself to rest, and I hadn't allowed myself that same grace.
He was able to give himself permission when you were not.
Exactly. This is one of the most common reasons for resentment. Someone else is giving themselves permission to fit one of their needs or wants or desires or preferences. Needs, wants, desires, preferences always come together in my world. They are a group, they are a crew. Yes. Someone else is allowing themselves to have or do one of those things, and you have decided you're not going to because self-neglect had felt safer at the moment, but then you're mad at that person for doing it.
I had a client once, a young gal who was engaged, and she was living with her boyfriend at the time. And she grew up she's now in her 30s. So millennial-ish, right? So she grew up overscheduled, right? So it was straight A student in high school, go right from high school to swim practice, and then right from swim practice for the swim team to the dance troupe, and then right from dance troupe home at night. And now we're shoving food in our mouth as we're doing homework, as we're listening to all this other chaos inside the house, and then we're collapsing, and then repeat, rinse, wash, repeat, rinse, wash. Okay. So it's hardwired into her nervous system that rest should be associated with guilt and shame.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no rest for the weary.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I will say, just because I look at everything through a much wider lens, I'm always looking at the intergenerational, construct in and around that. And she did come from a culture that was forced to immigrate at a time where maybe people didn't want to immigrate, and it was hard work, and rest was not okay.
Yeah.
It was like, you're going to rest, you're going to die.
Yeah.
That's kind of what's rooted inside the nervous system. And this was the messaging that was coming through as well. So part of her challenge in the sessions that we were having was, again, she had this anger, resentment, frustration, disappointment that she would fill every single minute of a weekend of doing. I have to do this. I have to do that. I have to do this. I have to do that. While her person is sitting on the couch and watching some fucking football.
Mm-hmm.
And she's angry about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to her, who are you really angry at?
Mm-hmm.
Are you angry at him because he sees rest as restoration?
Mm-hmm.
And he prioritizes rest as being restorative, and that you can't? Are you mad at yourself because it feels uncomfortable inside your nervous system to sit? That even if you force yourself to sit,
it's not going to feel
ding,
good.
ding, 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 ding. Like you're just feeling so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And so now you're even more angry because he can be comfortable and you're not.
Exactly.
Right? So that's both examples are really good examples of this is when you can feel that level of discomfort. That is your keyhole. That's like your window into this is where some work needs to be done.
Yeah. And here's what I start to learn about what it is that I need in the world. I didn't know that you're talking about other people saying like they didn't know what their needs were. I didn't know that I had needs. I didn't have needs. Other people have needs. I fulfill needs.
Because you were trained to meet other people's needs
exactly.
and ignore your own.
And then I chose a helping profession because that's comfortable for me because, right? La, la, la. Yeah. But the resentment started teaching me all the times that I was abandoning myself. And I
think that's the key word, self-abandonment.
I was floored by the information.
Yeah.
But resentment will also come up if you're the person who, like, when you started at the new workplace, you started bringing in cupcakes for a couple people's birthdays because you wanted to be liked. But now it's always expected that you bring the cupcakes. And by
the way, nobody brings in cupcakes
for yours. Nobody brings cupcakes for you because you're the cupcake lady. Right. When you're resentful about something like that, that's how you start to learn, oh, actually, I don't want to be responsible for the cupcakes anymore, which might require a conversation or might require that you just stop. It depends on the scenario. But and as people who work for themselves, so for anybody that's an entrepreneur that's listening, resentment is how I do my prices. It's how I decide who I'll work with. If the question that I ask myself when I got a request in today for a gig in just like a couple weeks, and we've been talking for a couple weeks, so there's a whole proposal and this is back and forth in the negotiation. The question that I ask myself is, if I say yes to this thing, will it interfere with how much generosity I want to give?
I've heard you say that before.
Right? Will I feel less than generous if I say yes to this thing? Because if I will, then I can't do it. That means that I'm resentful about how much money they're going to pay me. That means I'm not happy about what I'm getting from their side. So if it interferes with the feeling of generosity that I want to have, but generosity has to come from a fueled place. Is this going to fuel me enough to be as generous as I want to be? So that helps me as an entrepreneur. It helps me set my prices. It helps me say no to certain clients. It helps me decide how I want to show up, what I want to do, where I'm at, what my level is, and all of that, which is a useful little trick.
It's a brilliant little trick. And I think, as I'm looking at the time and I'm going to wrap us up, and it doesn't have to be in solopreneurship or entrepreneurship.
No, of course
it
not.
can be with your spouse.
Yeah.
It can be with your child. It can be with, anybody in and around your circle, even if you don't work or if it's not happening.
Yeah.
I mean, look, it doesn't happen in a silo. So if it's happening here, it's happening there.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're somebody who's maybe not working right now for a paycheck and you're still feeling all these things, what Cait just described is kind of the audit,
yes,
if you will, that you need to do in your life
to decide.
To
know two things. Number one, what you learn from resentment is where your boundaries are being crossed, most of the time by you. But that's a whole separate conversation. And the second thing you learn is every single place that you self-abandon and self-neglect.
Yeah.
Those two pieces of information will absolutely change your life if you let them.
Amen. Amen. What's the one thing you hope someone walks away with from today's conversation?
Burnout is not my fault and there's a way out.
I love it. This has been a huge pleasure for me. I could talk about it forever. And I feel so passionate about it just because it is such a global, it's kind of a pandemic. Like it's a global issue that is impacting a large majority of people around the world. And, you have the right to feel better. You have the right to not be trapped in this cycle. And so the purpose of today's conversation, as it is with every conversation I have, is to generate awareness, right? Once you become aware, you can take a different action. Once you can become aware, you can research a little bit. You can dive a little bit deeper. I mean, this is how Cait and I do our own work, is because we had our own experiences with burnout and started to dig a little deeper. What is it that I'm looking at? And how did I even, this should be the title of my book. How the fuck did I even get here? Because we're all struggling in some way, shape, or form. So thank you for gifting my audience with your brain today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Full of knowledge. And again, guys, you can check out Cait at her website. It's Cait Donovan. It's CAIT Donovan.com. Thank you so much, Cait.
Thank you.
I am so thankful for having Cait on today's episode and for her to share her insights on the profound effects of burnout on the brain. Cait's expertise offers valuable guidance for those looking to understand and overcome burnout. If this conversation resonated with you, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who could benefit. To learn more about Cait's work or to book her for a speaking engagement, please visit her website, Cait Donovan, CaitDonovan.com. Until next time.